Welcome everybody. This is the first video in our series Beyond Behaviorism, Applying Behavioral Neuroscience to Working with Fear in Horses. This is the first part of the video series, which will cover theory and frameworks, and this information is really crucial to understanding or having a better sense of what's happening in the video analyses that we will do in the follow-up videos. So thank you so much for your time and attention. This video is featuring myself, Sarah Schlote. I'm a master's degree in counseling psychology. I'm a registered psychotherapist, Canadian certified counselor, and somatic experiencing practitioner operating in Canada. And this presentation is being offered with the express permission of the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute in Boulder, Colorado, who owns the trademark for the somatic experiencing. So this video is going to really bring in a lot of Dr. Peter Levine's theory and how to apply that with horses. And in fact, perhaps an alternate subtitle for this presentation could be Somatic Experiencing for Horses. But I'll just leave it at that, and I'll speak a little bit more to this process and this theory base as we go along. But Dr. Peter Levine is the founder of Somatic Experiencing and the developer of a number of different books and resources that look at taking mammalian neuroscience and applying it to trauma therapy in humans. And interestingly enough, he's not the only one whose models have been based on the study of mammalian nervous systems and stress responses. Dr. Stephen Porges, whose work I will also be referring to throughout these videos, created the polyvagal theory. I will cover that a little bit more in detail during this first video. And these are models that are based on animal models of neuroscience and applied to humans. And so what's interesting for me is that we have all this wonderful breaking knowledge in this area, but we're not seeing it so much turned around and brought into working with animals, even though they're based on animal science. So my goal with this presentation or series of presentations is to help see if we can bring that material back around and see what applicability it has in understanding horses. There will be some applicability to this material with working with other animals as well, but I will be focusing specifically on horses. And of course, I will be citing some other people as well, Dr. John Bowlby, Dr. Mary Ainsworth, and among others, who are instrumental in the field of attachment theory, and also Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a key player in the field of developmental neuroscience. And what's important to know too in terms of languaging before we continue, I tend to use the word trauma-informed horsemanship a lot, and the word trauma-informed is an expression that's often seen in the literature these days: trauma-informed healthcare, trauma-informed social work, trauma-informed psychotherapy, trauma-informed schools, and I'm proposing that we can absolutely have a trauma-informed horsemanship, or trauma-informed horse care, or trauma-informed horse-human relationships, however you want to call it. And the word trauma is a really broad word. Many people think of that word and think very specific things and don't really find that that word refers to them. I find in my practice when I first meet with clients and I ask if there's a trauma background in my intake forms, and invariably people will say no. But as we get to know each other, it's very clear that there actually is a very significant trauma history. And so the word trauma may not be what you resonate with, but it's the material in these presentations is going to be relevant whether or not there's an identifiable trauma or you ascribe to that terminology. And this lens will be applicable regardless of whether you're a horse owner, if you're riding, if you're doing groundwork, if you're a health specialist, an equine health specialist, or if you're in equine assisted therapy and learning, and that's your field of work as well. So there will be some applicability in this material. Of course, treating trauma-related fear and anxiety in humans is going to be different from doing that with horses, but there will be some overlap, as we'll see. The other thing that's important to note is that, at least in human trauma therapy, treating trauma-related fear and anxiety is quite different from addressing fear and anxiety that are not rooted in trauma per se. And so if we're working with trauma-based anxiety and fear, that's going to require a little bit more than what we would typically use in sort of regular therapy with humans. humans. That said, there are certainly a number of people who also believe that the same is true for working with non-human animals, that anxiety that is trauma-based is going to be quite different to address than anxiety that is not at all trauma-based. So as this overview wraps up, it's important to know that this material has applicability across the board, whether or not trauma is on board. A trauma lens is a really helpful thing to have, even if you don't know the history, because the principles that we use when we have trauma-informed work tend to be just good principles in general. So that'll be our start. So I want to begin by talking a little bit more about the nervous system and how early on our understanding of the nervous system developed out of something that we call a two-branch model, also called a paired antagonism model or a linear reciprocal system. Big fancy words, essentially meaning that there was a sympathetic stress response and a parasympathetic relaxation response, and that there are these two branches that work sort of in opposite to each other. This particular view of the nervous system is well over 100 years old. It was proposed in the late 1800s, formalized a few decades later, and it's still the main model that's taught today in science and in the field of especially equine science, equine behaviorism, and horsemanship and other areas as well. Even sports psychology, I believe, still uses this model too. And so it's quite ubiquitous. And one thing that's interesting is that in the 1960s, this is quite some time ago now, Gellhorn was noticing in his studies of different lab animals and so on that under situations of extreme stress or trauma, the autonomic nervous system doesn't come back down to baseline and function in this sort of reciprocal way that was once thought to be the case. And so what can happen is that in these intense states of hyperarousal or activation, there can be both a high sympathetic charge and a high sympathetic shutdown at the same time. And some people have called that like having one foot on the gas and one foot on the brakes at the exact same time, which contradicts this idea of a two-branch model where the things are contradictory. So in the two-branch model of the nervous system, a common statement that we hear is, oh, you can't be stressed and relaxed at the same time. While that's not untrue, it doesn't really account for the fact that there's actually a lot more nuance going on, such as these states where both are actually happening at the same time. So Dr. Peter Levine came along in 1977 in his doctoral thesis dissertation research and proposed that the autonomic nervous system actually functions as a complex dynamical system as opposed to a very simple linear system that's comprised of feedback and feed-forward loops as opposed to simply up and down, making it a little bit more complicated to navigate. From this view, stress is not necessarily the problem in and of itself, because the nervous system, as a survival function, is meant to be able to cope with the stressors of life and restore balance after those stressors are over. So stress is not the issue, also because not all stress is distress. And so this distinction is starting to be made around this time. And the issue from Levine's standpoint, basing himself off of Gellhorn's work, is that the issue is actually the autonomic nervous system getting stuck and not resuming normal functioning to allow it to respond flexibly to the demands of life. Because we're meant to be able to move through these demands. And if you think about how we, before the lives that we had now, I mean, we were facing threats on a routine basis. And, if we had a nervous system that was that intolerant to stress, none of us would have survived to present day. So the sense is that the nervous system actually has a lot more resilience than we think. But the trouble is not so much the exposure to stress, but that the system gets stuck. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. So he talks about how the core response network will get stuck or stressed out in a traumatized state. But that state is actually, in principle, more or less fully reversible, which suggests that someone, or potentially even an animal, whose core response network is fully functional, will not accumulate allostatic load, so will not experience the cumulative effects of stress, which can be negative over time in response to challenging environmental circumstances, and that's what's going to be an evidence of resilience. It's more about being able to move through those responses as opposed to getting stuck in those responses, which is where we see a lot of health issues and so on. And heart rate variability research looking at coherence in heart rate, we know very well from stress studies and the adverse childhood experiences study that early adversity that induces these kinds of stress responses in the nervous system can result in issues in adulthood and long-term dysfunction in terms of health and overall resilience. And so that speaks a lot more to what Levine is saying. And so Peter Levine's model came out quite some time ago. Stephen Porges came along as well and proposed that a theory that's in alignment with Gellhorn and with Levine, saying that there's actually 3 branches of the nervous system and not just 2. And this 3-branch model is the one that will underscore this video series. And so it's rather simple, but at the same time quite nuanced. So the sympathetic nervous system is comprised, of course, of the gas pedal, which includes arousal and activation. So the difference being arousal is we experience arousal when we go for a walk, when we go for a jog, when we are late for a job interview, when we're having sex, when we are laughing and playing. Arousal is part of that gas pedal. Not all arousal is traumatic activation. So activation is when we go a bit higher and go into fight or flight, where there's fear and terror and other things happening, where there's what Porges would call a neuroception of danger. The brakes would be the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is the same as the original 2-branch model. The difference being is that there is actually 2 branches for the parasympathetic nervous system. The ventral vagal complex, or the VVC, and the dorsal vagal complex, or the DVC. And these 2 brake systems function a little differently to temper the arousal or activation of the gas pedal or the sympathetic nervous system. So I'll start with the ventral vagal complex. So the ventral vagal complex is also known as the social engagement system, and from an evolutionary standpoint, it's thought to be the most recent social part of the nervous system, which is evidenced most often in mammals. Birds have somewhat of a ventral vagal ability. They have a lot of social dynamics and so on, but this is most evolved in mammals. And the ventral vagal complex, the word vagal comes from vagus. And the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve that comes from the brainstem and sort of innervates. It's the longest, one of the longest nerves of the body. It's I believe the longest cranial nerve in the body. And it's about as long as, I think, even the spinal column. And it innervates the musculature of the face, the eyes, the middle ear. It comes into the striated muscles of the face and neck, in through the larynx and pharynx, to the heart, and also down to the gut. So the ventral vagus is actually innervating this part of the body. The dorsal vagus will be lower down. So the ventral vagus is up here, which is why it's called the social engagement system, because it innervates or connects with the parts of the body that are involved in social connection. These parts of the body need to be online in order for us to communicate, make eye contact, bond, and so on and so forth. And this section obviously connects with the heart. So when the social engagement system is online, i.e. when we feel safe in relationship, it acts as a pacemaker on the heart that allows us to modulate arousal so that we can be in safe connection with one another. So you can tell when an animal or a human is in ventral vagal dominated state because of the tone of their facial expression, tone of voice, posture, their gaze. Their gestures may be softer, more variable, calmer, curious, playful. There's ease of communication, and so on and so forth. So the ventral vagal complex is a brake system that modulates arousal so that we can be in connection, which means that those can be on at the same time to varying degrees. The ventral vagal complex is also involved in pieces of what we call regulation development. So we, as mammals, come into the world most of the time with auto-regulation on board. So auto-regulation are those key functions that make sure that we're living and breathing and our heart's beating, and we don't have to think about these things. These things just occur. Through bonded relationship, we experience co-regulation. In primates, that involves a lot of eye-to-eye, face-to-face contact. But in other mammals, it's also involving just close proximity, licking, touching, petting, grooming, and so on and so forth, lying with, and we have that with humans as well, where we're being held by, we're being, rocked by, we're being bounced by an adult that has hopefully a much more regulated nervous system. And then as we experience distress and as we receive co-regulation from those around us, our nervous system learns that what goes up must come down. We learn that modulation. And as a result of that, the brain can develop properly. The parts of the brain involved in development, learning, curiosity, getting to know the world, getting to explore, those parts of the brain start to develop properly because we're feeling safe, right? When we're not feeling safe, then those parts of the brain are not going to be developing properly, and we're going to be more caught in what we would call survival mode, but more about that in a moment. But with enough co-regulation on board, with enough safety in the environment, our body functions and develops properly, and the neural template gets set for self-regulation so that we're able to have more ability to regulate within ourselves. That doesn't mean that we don't benefit from co-regulation with others in adulthood, but that we have internalized a fair amount of that capacity within ourselves. Bowlby and Ainsworth, so that comes out of Kane and Terrell's work, a really excellent book called Nurturing Resilience that came out in 2018. Kathy Kane and Steve Terrell are teachers of mine. They're absolutely lovely, so definitely look them up. Components of attachment comes out of Bowlby and Ainsworth's work, and so they talk about the components of attachment being safe haven and secure base. So safe haven is, being in this environment where my needs are met and I'm safe and there's protection and there's responsiveness. When I cry, someone comes, when I'm hungry, I'm fed, and so on and so forth. When I'm feeling scared, I'm protected. So those components create a safe haven for us to develop as mammals. And then as we develop, we start to learn to explore our world, and we come back to our caregiver, our parent, as a secure base when we feel a little frightened or we need some soothing, and or we've gotten a little startled, so we come back to mom or to an allo parent from in our, community or in our herd, for instance, or our pack, and then we go back out in the world, explore again. And so other normal components of attachment include proximity seeking. So we're going to be likely to seek out our source of attachment because that's just how we function as mammals. And we will experience separation distress when we're away from our attachment figures. And as we develop secure attachment, that ability to stay in a sense of connection with our herd or our loved ones and so on when we're away, that ability to tolerate that gets better over time. So secure attachment would be that I can be away from my attachment figures and still feel safe and secure knowing the relationship is solid and that I'm okay. And so the biology of that social engagement system is what really allows for that secure attachment and co-regulation to occur. Let me move into the dorsal vagal complex. So that's the lower part of the vagus innervation, so heart and then into gut and lower down. So when the dorsal vagal complex is on low, so to speak, so a low tone dorsal vagal, so remember this is the parasympathetic nervous system, so a brake system like the previous brake system of the ventral vagal. The dorsal vagal low tone is what we would call rest and digest. So that's involved in sleeping, resting, nursing, feeding, and other quiet type things. So with humans, that might include like meditation, shavasana at the end of yoga, that kind of thing, prayer for those for whom faith and spirituality is an important resource, and so on and so forth. And the low tone dorsal vagal state is a restorative state. So that's often what we think about when we think of horses as they're grazing in a herd. They've got a certain amount of ventral vagal tone on and a certain amount of low tone dorsal vagal tone on as well. They're resting and digesting, especially horses in a herd that are lying down and having naps and so on. When we're sleeping, of course, there's going to be low tone dorsal because there's nothing really else happening. The dorsal vagal complex can also be on high. So, and when the dorsal vagal complex is on high, then we're seeing shutdown states of what we would call conservation. So, maintaining oxygen when we're in states of what we would call sometimes freeze, so tonic immobility, fold, which is collapsed immobility, faint or vasovagal syncope, which is when we fall unconscious, fainting death, fragmentation, another word for dissociation. So these are associated with the dorsal vagal complex. So low tone brake system would be rest and digest. High tone would be I'm just out. I'm completely out. I do want to clarify one thing before I continue. So I use freeze in this presentation to refer to tonic immobility that occurs during the dorsal vagal shutdown. So that's very different in use than the use of the word freeze that people talk about to refer to rigidity. Right? So rigidity is not necessarily a dorsal vagal state. One can be rigid and braced while experiencing resistance in a fight response, for instance, right? One can be rigid while in an arrest response, orienting to the current situation to notice what's going on in the environment. So, so while I appreciate some people do use freeze in referring to those states, to make things clear from our standpoint, I'll refer to freeze as being the tonic immobility response as opposed to bracing as part of a fight response and resistance or as a result of the arrest response when we're orienting to the environment. And that will keep all the, if I come back, all the Fs as survival responses sort of together, just for consistency's sake. So that doesn't mean that using freeze in that other sense is wrong, but just for the purposes of these videos, it will help to keep things consistent. So this is where things differ a little bit from the original two-branch model of the nervous system, is that there is a gas pedal and two brakes, and they function somewhat like dials, and they go from low to high. So the gas pedal, for instance, the sympathetic nervous system, can be on low, medium, high arousal, right? And if there's a sense of terror, it can go very, very high. But low arousal, moderate arousal, even higher arousal with the nervous system, if it's tempered by one of the other two brakes, especially the ventral vagal complex, doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a damaging effect. For instance, when we're in a high state of arousal and we're playing and we're not experiencing a sense of fear, that's a really high stress response that does not have a negative impact necessarily on the nervous system because there's a brake system in place that's modulating that stress response. So the two brakes are, again, the ventral vagal complex, which some people will refer to as foot brake number 1, social engagement. So the foot brake is when, it's a more gentle brake response. The dorsal vagal complex has also another foot brake. On the low end, rest and digest would be another foot brake. And on the high end is the emergency or hand brake. That's the shutdown response. And so where we start to see problems occur is when we start to have a high degree of gas pedal and a high degree of dorsal vagal complex at the same time. That's where we've got gas and brakes on at the same time, almost like we're driving our car with the gas pedal down and the handbrake on. And that's got a lot of demand on the nervous system. It's a high cost way of being in the world. And that's where we start to see those stuck states that create trauma and challenges with allostatic load in the nervous system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this first example. So in this first example, we have the gas pedal is off, the ventral vagal complex is off or on low, and the brake system is on, the dorsal vagal complex is on high, rest, and digest. And so if we think about those three dials, that would potentially represent sleeping, right? So when we're sleeping, usually there's not a lot of sympathetic tone. There's not going to be a lot of social engagement because we're not in social engagement, we're sleeping. And there's going to be a certain amount of rest and digest. So ideally when we're sleeping soundly, the dials would look something along these lines. Now these dials are fluctuating all the time. So these are static representations. It doesn't mean that they are always static like this. They actually are moving back and forth like perhaps an odometer on a car and a speedometer, and they're always doing that. Now somebody who has nightmares or night terrors during their sleep, we would see that high rest and digest low tone, and then we would also see a moderate amount or a high amount of stress response while we're in sleeping, which is where we sometimes have people who have sleep disorders because their gas pedal is on when they should be asleep. So this is sort of where we start to see these things happening at the same time. So that would be another example of the gas and the brakes being on at the same time, which contradicts that two-branch model. Here's another example. So here we have a gas pedal on to about moderate, medium amount of arousal. We've got a decent amount of social engagement system. We've got a fair amount of social engagement and just a small, tiny amount of that foot brake. And so that could potentially represent play, certain team sports, and so on, right? So there's a certain amount of arousal. There's not a lot going on in terms of the rest and digest because you're in busy activity. And there's a high amount of social connection, right? So think of playing soccer and then you pause for a little bit and the nervous system comes back down and you're watching the team and then we come back in again. And so these dials are going all the time. Let me go to the last one of the dials just as another example. So here we have tonic immobility. So we've got the gas on all the way and we've got the dorsal vagal, high tone dorsal vagal on all the way, and there's no ventral vagal brake on. So we've got foot and gas on at the same time, which would be this high state of what we're calling in these videos freeze, potentially what we also would call immobility with terror. Now, tonic immobility can occur without fear, but in this particular case, this could be an example of tonic immobility with fear. All right. And so as we were just saying, right, so the dials will fluctuate to varying degrees at the same time when we're feeling safe. So that would be an example of, if we're feeling safe, the sympathetic nervous system and the ventral vagal will be on and it will feel fun. Right? It won't feel fearful, right? So that's something like play. When play starts to, feel not so fun anymore, what's that expression? It's all fun and games until we lose an eye or someone loses an eye. So it's like, fun can be fun up until a point. And then if it starts to feel overwhelming or starts to feel threatening, the ventral vagal brake will come off, the sympathetic charge will increase because we're detecting danger, and we may either go into fight or flight or may go into a shutdown if we can't get away. Before we go into fight, flight, or freeze, mammals also have the social engagement system as a source of survival. So we have what I call find. So thanks to a colleague of mine for sharing that information. So she came up with the word find for this. So that would be Lazelle Bartlett-Jaretsky or Lazelle Jaretsky-Bartlett, I believe. So thanks so much, Lazelle, for that. So finding supports, resources, protection, and comfort would be one of the F survival responses involving the social engagement system. And then, of course, fawn, which is well known in the literature as appeasement behaviors to try to placate the person or the source of the threat. And when those are not available, then we go into fight or flight first, usually. And then if flight is not available, we fight when we're cornered. And then often if neither of those are available, then we go into the dorsal vagal Fs, as I call them: freeze, fold, faint, feign death, and fragment. This diagram is my best attempt at demonstrating those states and this idea that the nervous system has hierarchical responses. So as we just spoke about, we will start with the neuroception of safety. So neuroception is a term from Stephen Porges that talks about the idea of being able to detect the circumstances or the conditions of our environment. And if there's safety on board, then the nervous system is going to feel able to experience freedom, food, fun, and friends, and so and also rest and digest. So that neuroception of safety allows for two branches of the parasympathetic nervous system to be on. So the ventral vagal will be on down there, as well as the low tone dorsal vagal response can also be on down in this green zone. Now, of course, there's going to be a little bit of an overlap area with the yellow section of neuroception of danger. Not all yellow is going to be neuroception of danger. So we can have a gas pedal start to increase where there's a certain amount of safety still detected, like in play, right? where we can experience some arousal in the nervous system while also feeling in social connection or feeling safe. When that starts to tip out of the neuroception of safety into the neuroception of danger, then we're starting to see those survival responses start to kick in. So as I feel unsafe, I will start to no longer, be as able to connect with freedom and digest and have food and enjoy my friends. I might start to find resources or protection. I might start to fawn, appease, right, the source of the potential threat, flee or fight. And fidget is a term we often see in the animal literature. And those can be stress and calming signals, but also thwarted attempts at trying to fight or to flee. So you think of an animal that's sort of box stall weaving, or a horse that's box stall weaving, and it's frustrated and it's not able to get out. And so there's this sense of, oh, well, it's self-stimulating because this is the only thing it can do in this little confined space. That's often what we would call perhaps one of the fidget responses. It is also potentially a thwarted flight response. The horse is prevented from being able to escape, and so this little movement is a segment of that incomplete flight response. I want to escape and I can't, so here's a portion of that movement that's happening in the stall. In humans, we'll see things like addictions and OCD behaviors. We'll see that in non-human animals as well, which can also be considered under the fidget response. So as stress, arousal, or as the neuroception of danger starts to increase, then we're going to see more of that agitation start to kick in. When we hit the threshold of terror or overwhelm, then we start to go, that would be Porges's neuroception of life threat, where we go into freeze, fold, and all the other Fs that come with the dorsal vagal shutdown state. And then ideally, animals in the wild, and this is what's really interesting, Peter Levine found that animals in the wild, although routinely threatened on a daily basis, don't seem to be much worse for wear in terms of, animals don't usually walk around with PTSD. Now, animals in captive situations, and I include humans in that, do experience PTSD and trauma and so on and so forth. And I'll get to that in a moment. But the animals in the wild, if they are unable to use their social engagement system, they get picked out of the herd by a predator, they get brought down, they go into a freeze response. If by chance the predator goes away, gets distracted, something happens, the animal then has this ability to discharge out of that freeze response. So as we go into that freeze response, so we come out. And so what we'll see is that sort of completion or the deactivation of the stress response that happened as the animal was going into the shutdown. Whatever was in the queue at that point will start to come down the other side until they deactivate completely back into more of a sense of balance and homeostasis. And this is this idea that Levine was talking about with stress is not so much the issue. The issue is getting caught in fight or flight responses and not being able to come back down. So being caught in hyperarousal or being caught in hypoarousal in those big freeze responses and not being able to restore balance in the nervous system. And so when the ability to discharge those responses is thwarted, it's interrupted, we're shamed, we're punished, we're judged, we're laughed at, we're ridiculed, we're medicated, we're confined, we're not able to actually do what the body wants to do, that stress stays activated or locked into the nervous system. So we'll call that bound activation. So let me go through these slides. So Levine will say that animals recover through a freeze state by shaking and passing through the immobility response and becoming fully mobile and functional again. So what goes up must come down. And there are certainly a number of videos on YouTube that show animals moving through that natural response. If you go to equisoma.com, so www.equusoma.com, there are a number of videos peppered throughout the website that show animals moving through that discharge response quite naturally. And there's also a YouTube channel for Equisoma that has a number of different videos and playlists. And my playlist on educational or neuroscience videos has some of these videos of animals moving through the discharge response, including a horse. So feel free to have a look. And as I was saying, so wild animals normally have the ability to discharge that buildup of survival energy. We don't see that as much in captivity. So humans, often horses that are kept in stalls for long periods of time, animals in the entertainment industry, animals in the food industry, lab animals, and so on, and even dogs in crates for 12 hours a day, or that are sort of bred for meat and so on. Like, we're seeing a lot of this trauma in animals that are not able to move through these responses naturally. So, as we know, this energy, this heightened energy, is meant to pass through. It's meant to be time limited, right? Even the freeze response is meant to be time limited. And Peter Levine will call that self-paced termination. So in his book, In an Unspoken Voice, from I believe 2010, there's a really great explanation of self-paced termination and how we can go into a shutdown state without any kind of fear or terror, and we come out of that freeze response quite naturally with a little bit amount of time. But what can happen is that the more we have fear and terror, the more we are unable to escape and there's perceived terror, then the shutdown, it's much more difficult to come out of that freeze response or those collapse responses. And we're really meant to return to a normal rhythm after danger ends. And this is the crux of the issue. So again, it's not so much stress, but it's where stress is not able to, or the stress response is not able to move through and complete and return to baseline. So a wording that will be helpful as we look at the analysis videos will be organic pendulation. So pendulation is the nervous system's movement from arousal and activation to settling and deactivation. So as we were saying, humans and captive animals, these organic pendulations are often disrupted or thwarted, right? We get stuck in that process and we're not able to complete or come down from our experiences. So as a result of that, the nervous system just does not reset. And we start to see what I call the 5 disses. So dysregulation, dissociation, disconnection, disorganization, and disorientation in response. And so according to Levine, completing those pendulations is actually what grows the window of tolerance and helps develop resilience. So that's restoring healthy functioning of the core response network, which is all these pieces that we've been talking about. And so the goal in somatic experiencing with humans as a trauma therapy is to build the tolerance or capacity to have more effective responses to stress without getting stuck in hyperarousal and flooding or hypoarousal and shutdown. And that would be the definition of resilience from a somatic experiencing standpoint, is being able to move through those responses and have those complete pendulations happen. What we'll see often is the case is stimulus stacking. So when we're unable to complete pendulations of activation and deactivation, that's where we start to see flooding and overwhelm. And as a result of flooding and overwhelm, we get a narrower window of tolerance. Reinforced kindling. So kindling is a phenomenon that happens in the nervous system. For those of you who are ever in Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, and so on, kindling is the small stuff that you use to start a fire, right? And that small stuff creates a spark, and that bursts into a flame pretty quickly. And so kindling of the nervous system happens when, as a result of repeated experiences, and it can even just be a one-time learning experience that provided that kind of a fear combined with an inability to escape, and that high charge that happens in future situations that are even remotely similar, that kindling will create a spark to a flame very, very fast. So we start to see that quick arousal pattern, or what we would call an overcoupling dynamic, where things happen really quickly in response to other scenarios that are potentially threatening, even if there is no threat anymore, which increases avoidance and resistance. So in this particular diagram here, we see a stimulus, a rise in activation, a little bit of coming down, and then another stimulus happens, and then there's another rise, and we don't really ever fully come down. We just keep building and building and building that stress response. And so the nervous system would be stacked, right? We'll see a lot of bound activation in the system, so that, if you were to poke an animal or a human in that high state, it wouldn't take a lot to create an outburst, right? Because there's so much being held in the system at that point. And what we're looking for, what Peter Levine suggests is going to be a key to resilience and restoring healthy nervous system functioning in mammals, is this idea of completing pendulations. So if we start a stimulus and the nervous system starts to increase And then we allow it to peak and fall at a smaller level, at a smaller threshold of charge. And then it deactivates, and there's a phase of integration, allowing that body to come back down and the body to go, oh, right, I'm okay. Like, this wasn't awful, I'm safe, right? And that pendulation is allowed to complete. And then before we introduce a new stimulus and then let that deactivate or discharge, that will start to build the window of tolerance for progressively larger capacity to be with bigger things. Right? And over time, what can happen is that those bigger things also get deactivated. So something that was quite large in activation will actually become less activating over time. And what we're doing here is we're resetting that core response network. We're resetting the nervous system, which allows for that growing of the window of tolerance, as opposed to in the previous slide where we're just continuing up into hyperarousal, which could also go into a shutdown, right? Because when we get that high, there aren't a lot of options anymore. So, conditioning theory, this is a quote by Peter Payne, Peter Levine, and Marty Crane-Gaudreau, who Peter Payne and Marty Crane-Gaudreau I've met at a conference recently and was very pleased to chat with them a little bit more about their work. And they state that conditioning theory says that in the extinction process, a conditioned fear response is not actually eradicated, but only suppressed by competing or positive conditioned experiences. And so this is part of learning theory and behaviorism. And the implication of this, born out of experience, is that although fear deconditioning is quick and effective, it can also easily be disrupted, as re-exposure to trauma-related cues can easily reinstate the fear response. And so in their paper talking about the importance of somatic experiencing as a different model for understanding the nervous system, behaviorism works quite well for more run-of-the-mill type stressors and anxiety type things, but if we're talking bigger experiences of trauma, sometimes straight behaviorism is not going to be sufficient according to this particular understanding of a three-phase nervous system. There's more going on. So to differentiate, the goal is not simply desensitization or operant conditioning, although obviously those are really helpful processes, and those are necessary at times and have their place. But if fear and symptoms are due to a disorganized, complex, dynamic system, a process model, as opposed to simple conditioning, then we have to look at things a little bit more complexively. The goal, obviously, again, is not to avoid stress or adversity, because avoiding stress and adversity creates phobias and limits the window of tolerance. So we want to be able to grow the capacity to be with higher thresholds without going into flooding or shutdown. And as I say here, avoiding stress is just as problematic as too much stress. So we're looking to titrate, so to speak, to make it tolerable. And the goal is to restore functioning in the nervous system. Now, there are a few different stages involved in that process. So Lewis and his colleagues wrote a book called A General Theory of Love way back in 2000, and it was looking at attachment theory and other pieces. And they proposed that the limbic remodeling, when we're trying to change things in the nervous system, when we're trying to shape what's happening with the brain, that we start with limbic resonance. So that would be the pinging, as Kathy Kane would say, between two mammals when they attune to one another's states. When we're with one another, we sense one another. We can tell when the one next to us is agitated because we feel it in our own body, right? We can tell when the person or the animals next to us is calm because we feel that calm in our own body. Limbic regulation would be noticing and responding to the cues in the other to support soothing, comfort, regulation, or protection, and so on. And then limbic revision is integrating a new neural template for safety in relationships and connection. So as we ping off each other, as we regulate with one another and find safety with one another, we develop new pathways in the brain that set a new template for relationships and connection. Peter Levine talks about this idea of renegotiation. And so from his perspective, and I quote, "It is not simply reliving a traumatic experience, it is rather the gradual and titrated revisiting of various sensory motor elements comprising a particular trauma. Renegotiation occurs primarily by accessing procedural memories or body memories associated with the two dysregulated states of the autonomic nervous system, hyper and hypoarousal, and then restoring and completing the associated active responses." So as this progresses, the client, and I would argue animals as well, can move towards equilibrium, relaxed alertness, and more of a present time orientation. I'm back in the moment with you here. Peter's understanding of renegotiation is largely about this idea of completing incomplete responses in the nervous system to reset the core response network and discharge the traumatic bound activation that's still in the nervous system. I would propose that there's more to it than that, and I think he would agree too. There's some evidence of this in his work, but I'll refer to it a little bit differently, where we have what we need to have first is relational renegotiation. So before we're able to move through any kind of stuck fight or flight response, so to speak, or move through freeze, we need to be able to feel safe, right? That neuroception of safety, as Steve Porges talks about, is so crucial. So that involves feeling felt and getting gotten by the other, this idea of a reciprocal experience, right? Responsiveness, attunement, co-regulation, repairing ruptures. So if we happen to misstep or act a little too harshly, and how do we repair that? How do we address the relationship to support limbic remodeling so that we feel safe with one another? And that requires the human to attend to their own unresolved stuff, right? So as the human in the equation with a horse, we really need to be monitoring our own nervous system activation patterns, our attachment patterns, the way we respond or react, our own dysregulation, and how that impacts the horse's sense of safety. And that safe haven relationality, as some will call it, is, from a learning theory standpoint, a behavioral antecedent that will set the conditions for what Peter calls, this idea of renegotiation from a physiological standpoint. So experiencing a different outcome in a familiar situation or a familiar dilemma. So here's where we talk about this idea of completing the biological responses, releasing constriction. Some people in the myofascial release world will talk about unwinding out of a stress response. So that would be sort of this place. We don't unwind and complete responses if we don't feel safe. So it's important to recognize that. Being able to tolerate goodness. We can tolerate goodness and pleasure when we're feeling safe. We don't really experience pleasure and safe, when we're not feeling safe. So those pieces are really important. And being able to experience a full deactivation and not getting stuck in overwhelm or immobility, right? And when that happens, then we get to have a different experience of our sense of self. So experiencing ourselves differently in a familiar situation, such as increased or more effective capacity, resilience, a bigger window of tolerance, which increases a better sense of our boundaries, better time orientation. I'm in the now. I'm not caught in every other trauma time in the past, right? This scary object on the ground in front of me isn't the one from, 5 weeks ago that was going to eat me. This is a different situation. So we're not looking for the reenactment of past patterns, but developing new outcomes in the present as opposed to repeating or reliving trauma. And that's going to create a sense of I can, which counteracts what we would call a sense of I can't. So Peter Levine in Somatic Experiencing would call that a counter vortex experience. The trauma vortex is these experiences of defeat, learned helplessness, shut down, right, where we're not able to be successful and find a sense of agency and confidence. And an I can experience is being able to move through that freeze or that defeat and come back through into our responses, find the capacity within ourselves, experience a sense of triumph and mastery and competency, pride, and so on. And those are very, what he again would call the counter vortex or a resourced kind of experience that can do wonders in renegotiating a lot of this nervous system dysregulation. So once again, our experience as the human in the horse-human dynamic is super important. And our own dysregulation and our own attachment patterns actually has been found to affect what interventions or training interventions we use with horses and when. We know that that's true for parenting. So if we have a particular unresolved traumatic pattern, if we were parented in a particular way, we tend to respond in a similar way, sometimes, not always. And if we have had a similar kind of background, that will affect how we actually train our horses as well. So the people there, great study to look into, looked at attachment styles and the types of horse training methods that were used, and the types of perceptions of horse behavior. And so people who had a particular attachment style were more likely to view the horse as naughty or disrespectful or mean or trying to be dominant, versus people who had a different attachment style who tended to see the horse as, just being confused and responding to the human's confusing cues or dysregulation. And so very different perspectives on the horse, which are influenced by our own backgrounds and our own states. So this comes back again to Porges, so I'll leave you all on this for now, that the neuroception of safety for the horse, in order to be able to renegotiate scary situations or scary objects, begins with us in our own state. And so Dr. Porges will say the feeling of safety is actually the treatment. And that's where we begin. So if you're interested in learning more, please do check out the next videos in this series. We'll be doing a video analysis, Julie Lannen in Australia, who is showing some videos with her horse Star, and working with him to try to address his fear of a particular object. And I will be going through those training videos with her from the lens of somatic experiencing, polyvagal theory, attachment theory, behavioral neuroscience, and a few other models. And if you're interested further, certainly check out the website, www.equisoma.com, for trainings on equine-assisted trauma recovery and trauma-informed horsemanship.